Hello and welcome to my presentation on Berman's negative analytic. The negative analytic is an idea put forward by Antoine Berman in his paper La traduction comme l'épreuve de l'étranger, translated by Venuti as Translation and the Trials of the Foreign, which is included in Venuti's Translation Studies Reader. Berman begins his essay by describing a form of translation that conveys the strangeness or foreignness of the original and laments that translation tends to do the opposite and naturalize the text. His negative analytic aims to give an analytical structure to how this process takes place. He also calls for an accompanying positive analytic, but it is not entirely clear how he intends what he calls literal translation in the final paragraphs of the article to be put into practice. Berman examines the process of naturalization, which equates to what Venuti later calls domestication, by means of a negative analytic comprising 12 deforming tendencies. These tendencies basically represent ways in which translation naturalizes the foreign text, rather than allowing it to be received as foreign. Although the essay starts with a discussion of Hölderlin's translation of Sophocles, Berman is particularly concerned here with the novel, which he sees as being an especially polyphonic genre, such that its disorderly nature makes it especially susceptible to the deforming tendencies of translation, while also making their effects harder to detect, although he tends to bring in examples from poetry from time to time. For Berman, the homogenization the deforming tendencies cause is not neutral, but has an ethical dimension, as it forms part of what he terms an ethnocentric annexation of the foreign text, echoing the idea of the cultural turn. The first of the 12 tendencies Berman identifies is rationalization. This is the tendency to rearrange sentences and punctuation to conform to a certain idea of order. According to Berman, this also involves nominalization and choice of more general terms, rendering the prose more orderly and abstract. This process is typical of what Berman calls ethnocentric translation, and could be understood as part of a process of making the text appear more natural to a target readership, hence the charge of ethnocentricity. The second tendency is clarification, which Berman considers a corollary of rationalization and an inherent feature of translation, which always involves a degree of explicitation. However, although explicitation may be illuminating, making clear something that is not clear in the original, it can also aim to render clear something that is intentionally unclear. However, although Berman presents this as a choice by translators, it may in some cases be unavoidable, given the constraint highlighted by Jacobson that languages differ essentially in what they must convey and not in what they may convey. A corollary of the first two tendencies is what Berman terms expansion, namely the tendency for the translation to be longer than the original. Berman considers this unfolding of the text to be unnecessary and only serve to obscure the work's own voice, inflating or expanding the work and impairing its rhythmic flow. Rather than a tendency in its own right, this appears basically to be the consequence of rationalization and explicitation. Moreover, Berman does not address the possibility that translating in some language directions may produce longer target texts due to structural differences, independently from any expansion. A further tendency is that of ennoblement, which in prose is the rhetorization or production of elegant sentences. This sets out to produce a readable text by smoothing out any apparent clumsiness and complexity of the original. This would seem to be along the lines of what Venuti terms fluency when he says, "Publishers, copy editors, reviewers have trained us, in effect, to value translations with the utmost fluency, an easy readability that makes them appear untranslated, giving the illusory impression that we are reading the original." Qualitative impoverishment refers to the replacement of terms, expressions, and figures in the original with terms, expressions, and figures that lack their sonorous richness, or correspondingly their signifying or iconic richness. Iconicity here means a feature of the physical substance of the word or expression that possesses something of the thing it refers to. Although onomatopoeia is the example par excellence of where the Saussurean concept of the arbitrariness of the sign seems to break down, Berman chooses butterfly as a word that possesses something of the butterfly's butterfly existence. Capturing the evocative force of the words used is no doubt something translators of poetry constantly struggle to achieve. Presumably Berman's criticism here is that translators of novels tend not to do likewise. Quantitative impoverishment is a loss that occurs when the translation contains fewer signifiers than the original. This may be because the translation uses fewer synonyms, and this tendency can coexist with an increase in the quantity or mass of the text with expansion. Translating results in a text that is at once poorer and longer. One possible objection here is that although languages may vary in the number of synonyms available for any given concept, compensation always remains an option. Berman's extrapolation from the lexical loss in one example translation to a general principle does not seem entirely justified. As I mentioned at the beginning, Berman is primarily concerned with the translation of novels, so he is at pains to point out that destruction of rhythms can affect prose as well as poetry, and can be caused by an arbitrary revision of the punctuation. Punctuation is also an issue mentioned in the case of rationalization, and seems to be a particular concern of his. The destruction of underlying networks of signification refers to the loss of linkages between words that lie beneath the surface meaning of the text. These groupings of signifiers organize the work's mode of expression, and failure to transmit them destroys this signifying process. As in the case of the destruction of rhythms, Berman seems to be suggesting that translators systematically ignore the more poetic aspects of the novel. This idea is picked up again in what he calls the destruction of linguistic patternings, this patterning being a preference for certain types of construction, forming part of what might be termed the writer's style. It is not entirely clear, however, how a writer's style could be preserved in translation unless by the sort of naturalizing strategy of translating as if the author had written in the target language, which seems to be precisely what Berman is criticizing. The destruction of vernacular networks, or their exoticization, refers to the difficulty of translating vernaculars, such as dialects. Berman does not seem to offer any prescriptions here, merely pointing out the pitfalls of attempting to translate the vernacular, apparently recognizing that dialect cannot be translated, and that the result of attempting to render a foreign dialect with a local one is likely to be merely ridiculous. Once again, in the case of the destruction of expressions and idioms, Berman highlights a problem but does not appear to offer much by way of a solution. As he points out, even where equivalent expressions exist, they do not translate the original idiom. Using equivalence in this way is another instance of ethnocentrism. His appeal to a proverb consciousness, allowing foreign idioms to be accepted by a process of kinship, seems potentially culture-specific. The last of the deforming tendencies is the effacement of the superimposition of languages. Berman considers the novel to be particularly polyphonic, and thus that it may bring together various combinations of dialect and common language. This superimposition of languages tends not to be transmitted in translation. In seeking to produce a text that is clearer and more elegant than the original, the translation privileges the meaning over the letter of the text, implying that it tends to use standard language as the optimal way of delivering meaning unobtrusively. Berman's deforming tendencies highlight a number of ways in which translators add to the text and a number of ways in which they subtract from it, all of them being a form of loss. The negative analytic critiques a tradition in translating dating back at least to Dryden and criticised by Schleiermacher, who argued that translators are often required to show the work as it would have been had the author himself written it originally in the reader's tongue. Thus, on Schleiermacher's distinction between foreignizing and naturalizing tendencies in translation, Berman is clearly describing the latter. However, unlike Schleiermacher, Berman is skeptical of the distinction between literary and non-literary translation, possibly because he is more concerned with the prose of the novel than with poetry. For Schleiermacher, however, naturalization is unattainable because language shapes thought to such an extent that if Cicero or Plato had been German, they would have written something quite different from the works they actually wrote, making it illusory to seek to translate them as if they had written in the target language. By contrast, for Berman, this domestication not only happens, but needs to be resisted by a reflection on the properly ethical aim of the translating act, receiving the foreign as foreign. This is a call that has been taken up by Venuti in particular, who ties it in with his agenda of resisting what he considers the invisibility of the translator in the contemporary publishing system, particularly in the English-speaking world. As well as the specific reservations I've raised along the way, Berman's analysis can be critiqued on several further points. Firstly, he describes his analysis as being analytic in both the Cartesian, i.e. positivistic, and psychoanalytic senses. However, as a psychoanalytic approach, it seems to leave a number of important questions unanswered. Are we to understand the source text as a primal scene the translator is seeking to repress? In which case, what drive urges him or her to translate it at all? Eros or Thanatos? Is the act of translation the expression of the translator's drive for self-annihilation? That would certainly be a radical interpretation of the translator's invisibility, but is hard to take seriously. It is, of course, also questionable to what extent the deforming tendencies are truly unconscious. There may rather be strategies translators deploy in order to get their work accepted, whether by readers, editors, or publishers. As a detailed analysis of the deforming tendencies, Berman's account is perhaps more successful, as it offers an interesting and apparently systematic account of the naturalization or domestication process in translation. However, his division into 12 tendencies seems somewhat arbitrary, as some, such as clarification and expansion, could perhaps be considered facets of the same tendency. There is also no assurance that the list is complete, despite the round number. Moreover, Berman offers only anecdotal evidence, such that his claim that these are general tendencies in translation would benefit from stronger empirical support. Indeed, some of the tendencies may in fact be language direction specific. Despite its shortcomings, the analytic is undoubtedly of use in raising translators' awareness when defining strategies and making choices, and it offers valuable insights and adds another dimension to studies of translation loss, although Berman himself says that mere awareness is not enough. However, as a manifesto for foreignization in translation, it seems to ignore translators' conscious choices and fails to address the agency of the reader, who is assumed to be a passive consumer of whatever translators produce. The enrichment of the language by foreignizing translations assumes a language community willing to be enriched, which was perhaps the case with the classics, given their perceived high status. However, languages may be open to foreign influences to varying degrees at different historical moments, and perhaps more open to influence from some languages than others. Without further evidence, it is questionable to what extent a strategy of foreignizing translations from all languages all of the time is likely to succeed. Testing.